Okay, so I have a little lecture for you tonight. It's about a concept it's kind of subtle, but I think if you get it, it can really help to open up your ideation process and the ability to not only come up with ideas, but then the visual kind of design concepts that build on top of the ideas. And I think it's something that I only maybe realized was at work within the last 2 years, but recognizing it, I can look at other projects and see not necessarily how I could have done them differently, but what I could have done to have been more productive on them. This lecture is called Isolating the Insight. So my thesis, we often wind research and ideation so tightly around each other that we miss a critical point between research and concept, the insight. We always have the insight, we just don't always recognize it. So this idea that I'm thinking about is a lot of times you're working on something and you have an idea and you think of whatever the visual concept is. And I'm gonna get into an actual workable example in a second. What we don't often realize is that visual concept is built on this little tiny intermediary piece where you looked at something or read something, you thought about it, and you formulated a thesis. But then, like what I used to do, and I think is really typical, you immediately jump into the visual part of it, and you don't sit on that thesis for a moment and brainstorm off that. All right, so here's an example. This is a really old piece, like 2004. It's from Intermedia Arts. So it's 11 by 17 flyer for this program called Encyclopedia of Hip Hop Evolution. And the concept was to use photos of painted over graffiti and hand-drawn lettering as references to hip hop culture and rough materials as a metaphor for underground DIY aesthetics. The origins of the concept. I was struggling with super bad creative block. I was definitely late with this. I worked on it daily for something like 3 weeks and could not get a workable thing started. And I did that thing where people are like, oh, go for a walk. I went for a lot of walks and wasted a lot of time, and I could not come up with an idea. There's sort of two things happening. I'm only really gonna talk about where this idea came from and what I could have done to kind of beef it up a little bit. So I had this photo project I was doing with my wife where we were shooting painted over graffiti because we liked the kind of Rothko aspects of it. And I saw those photos and I was like, well, that's almost like graffiti, and then it's like reinterpreting it. That's kind of neat. Research. I had basically no research aside from meeting with the two program directors. So I met with them. They gave me whatever kind of ridiculous brief that we had that was usually not really a brief. And then I went to work on it. I don't think I read anything. I don't know what I looked at during that time. I just remember coming up with idea after idea that I threw away really quickly and being really stressed out about it until I had this idea. And I have to say it's just that I was looking at the photos and was like, oh, maybe this is a thing. So that's one project. This one didn't have creative block. So this was a little booklet about Yay Big for the Moving Lives Speakers Bureau, which was a speakers bureau of creative people who were immigrants, and they could go to schools and organizations and talk about the overlap of those experiences. This was a program run by Intermedia Arts back in 2004, 2005. So the concept, design the booklet after airline boarding passes as an analog to the idea that exposure to other stories is like traveling. In addition, it is a hand-drawn boarding pass because I think I didn't want it to look slick. But it's like a metallic green ink. It's got all the weird little crazy dots and stuff. And I feel like you don't get boarding passes anymore, so the reference doesn't make as much sense. But in 2004, boarding passes looked cool as shit, and they had metallic inks, and they were nice. The origins, I probably saw a boarding pass in my house and got the idea. Research, none that I can recall aside from meeting with the program directors. So this kind of popped in my head afterwards as I was putting this together, but the other night, a couple people asked about research, and I realized when I was a student, I didn't really do research. And when I did, I didn't know how to do anything with the research, so it was really unproductive. It was more like another avenue to get the paralysis by analysis kind of situation happening. And so when I went into work, I still wasn't doing any research, because if you can't figure out how to use the research, it's just the thing to confuse you more, unless you get some little glint of something that gives you an idea. In this instance though, I didn't do any research, and the glint of an idea came from random encounters with objects, which is not great. On the one hand, it works a lot like when people say, oh, go for a walk or take a shower or do something unrelated. But when you're under the gun, you don't want a random encounter with a photograph or a boarding pass to be the way that you come up with an idea. That in me is what kind of happens is there's like research, which is like absorption of a subject. In this instance, my minimal research is just a meeting, right? And I just ask a couple questions and they tell me about the program. And then the concept is a visual metaphor to express an idea. But there's this thing that comes right between those, an insight. And that's the thesis that that concept is based upon. So it's really important to point out with those projects, I only had one idea. The hip hop one, I had lots of ideas. They were all garbage, but none of them were related to the final thing that I made. And the same with the Moving Live Speakers Bureau. I had that one idea, that one version, that's it, end of story. I don't even know if I could have come up with 2 ideas if I needed to. So I'm gonna kind of map this out a little bit more. Like, what was the research for the hip hop flyer? Basically, meeting with them, thinking, and wandering around. No kind of formal research. The insight that came out though was to reinterpret hip hop aesthetics and express DIY materiality of early hip hop. And the concept was use photos of painted over graffiti and hand-drawn lettering, and then use rough paper and a dark color palette. So when I did this, I knew that this one, the concept, was doing that other thing, but I never isolated the other thing. And if you think about it, use photos of painted over graffiti and hand-drawn lettering. Okay, cool, I had this concept and finally had something to do and I made it work. But if I had isolated reinterpret hip hop aesthetics, I probably could have come up with 30 ideas really easily. But I used to have the idea wrapped up with the concept so tightly that I just had the one idea. So let's say they hated what I showed, I wouldn't have realized that maybe I had a great insight, but a bad concept or a bad execution, and then I could have dug back into that for a lot of ideas. So the Speakers Bureau, same thing. Meeting, thinking, wandering around. The insight is exposure to other viewpoints, expands your world like travel. Hand-drawn elements express the human drama of immigration. And the concept is make a booklet of hand-drawn boarding passes for each speaker. Again, what ended up happening is I was aware of that middle idea, but not as an end into itself that could have led to a plethora of ideas. One of the things that needs to be pointed out is like in that Speakers Bureau thing, the spreads that show the speakers, every single one of them looks exactly the same. Because once I had the concept, my range of thinking or processing was kind of so limited that I couldn't figure out how to pull apart a language that I could then reassemble, if that makes sense. Once I had the idea, I just stuck to it as closely as is humanly possible because I really wasn't able to isolate it in a way where it could have been richer. And then the other thing is I'm pretty sure I did that hand-drawn thing because like I talk about how my goal is to start a project and be a little bit uncertain about what will be at the end. Like I want there to be a surprise. I think once I could see like, oh, it's this, that got rid of the element of surprise. So my stupid idea was to spend way too many hours drawing the elements of a boarding pass when it was really unnecessary. Like I don't think it helps the concept. It's cool looking, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't make sense. But I think I did that because I didn't have a lot of confidence in my one idea because I didn't truly get it, if that makes sense. So in both cases, I didn't develop the insight until I had a chance encounter with another material. They were basically, in my mind, one and the same. And this is pretty much how I was taught to do graphic design. Like, we weren't taught, figure out this thesis and then multiple ways to execute against it. It It was always just like, what's the concept? And the concept was always this visual thing that correlated back to that insight, but we never isolated the insight, which to me is like, it's the most critical thing now. So that prevented me from developing a better concept or any other concepts for that matter. Because to have another concept would have required yet another insight, and maybe I'm not smart enough to have another insight. You know, like maybe the one I have is the one I've got. Here's my general theory, like research in and of itself is not gonna lead to a concept. Let's say we're doing a project on Ringo Starr. If I read the Wikipedia and read everything about him, all that's gonna happen is I've read something, and I know random facts about Ringo Starr. I have to find something in that research to grab a hold of, right? Like I can't, if I just read it, cool, I read Wikipedia today, and I'm gonna know random factoids about Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr. I have to find something that matters. So like, here a thing that stood out, during the recording of the White Album, he quit the Beatles because McCartney was a dick, John Lennon was a dick, Yoko Ono was a dick, and he was over it, so he quit. And he went out on Peter Sellers' boat for 2 weeks and wrote Octopus's Garden about just wanting to be left alone, to tend to his garden underneath the sea. Like, how much more autobiographical does it get? And then when he came home, when he came back, they sent him telegrams every day, trying to get him to join the band again, even though they hated each other, except they all loved him, and they all hated each other. That's like the beauty of it. George Harrison had covered his drum kit in flowers as a welcome back gesture. That's like a thing, like all of a sudden, like, okay, that's interesting. And then there's like this, collaborations between ex-Beatles. This is neat. Ringo repeatedly collaborated with every member of the Beatles, and the rest of them did not. So that's an interesting fact. And if I think about those two facts, maybe I have an insight. And if I have the insight, the ideas are gonna flow out of it. So let me show you what I mean. Research, reading about Ringo Starr, highlights, quits the Beatles because they're jerks to each other. Not to him, just to each other. Band sent him telegrams every day for 2 weeks to come back. Ringo's the only member to collaborate with all Beatles after they broke up. Insight, Ringo was the coolest Beatle. That's the insight, right? Him quitting the band is not an insight, it's just simply a fact. If I have to have an opinion or a thesis about it. So now if we go forward, if I take that idea, I can develop a lot of concepts from it. I could make a portrait, modify a portrait of the Beatles so Ringo has a halo. Take all the Beatles covers and enlarge him so that he's the most visually important. Make a collage that's mostly articles about how everybody is suing each other, but how Ringo is working with everybody. Take the collaborations page that we just looked at and just make a visual poster out of it, like almost like an infographic. Create an image of a drum set covered in flowers. Old me, the way I would have thought about it, is I would have immediately, the minute I had this clue, I would have jumped over here and tried to come up with one idea. I wouldn't have stopped for a minute and said, what's a bunch of ways to express that? Which, I don't know if, can everybody kind of grasp how that's really different and potentially really powerful? That if you immediately go over here, then you have to make this thing, and maybe you make versions of it, but if it doesn't work out, it's very frustrating. But if you go back a step and you isolate just that thesis, then when you get over here and say you do this, and it sucks, well, you came up with 5 other ideas in 10 seconds, you can probably come up with a lot more. And that's not even doing additional visual research. It's just taking that thesis and being like, what's a bunch of ways to express this idea? If we take Encyclopedia of Hip Hop Evolution and the insight, reinterpret hip hop aesthetics. If I start there, then I have concepts. Use the graphic language of encyclopedias because of the name. Commission an oil painting of graffiti. Make cast sculptures of iconic hip hop forms like turntables and microphones and blah, blah, blah. Use the total visual opposite of hip hop, which I don't know what that'd be, but like let's say classical music, but then amplify the copy, the language, so that it's kind of screaming hip hop. Tell, don't show by making a poster that says like microphone, turntable, spray paint, mixer, Adidas, giant type. Shoot clinical cold photos of iconic hip hop forms. Hybridize graffiti with another set of visual code. So take some other visual language and then mesh it with graffiti. Here's what's interesting. That was done in I don't know how many seconds. Like it took me a minute to come up with those ideas. That's not because I've been stewing on it for 14 years. It's because like I have a different way of thinking about it and approaching it. And so then I could come up with a ton of ideas, whereas at that time, that was the only idea that I could come up with that got anywhere near the end. But if I had been able to see that kernel that led to the idea, I probably could have shown up to that initial meeting and been like, here's the thing I'm thinking about, here's 3 ways to do it. But instead, all I had was that whole thing kind of intertwining this one idea. Same with this moving lives one. So if the insight is exposure to other viewpoints expands your world like travel, then the concepts could be make a booklet of hand-drawn boarding passes for each speaker, record testimonials from audience members about how the speakers expanded their worldview, design a fake travel brochure, use comparative facts about the US and each speaker's birthplace, design a passport-style booklet, shoot portraits of each speaker at a passport photo station. So instead of having a commercial photographer shoot like black and white like studio photography, which is what we did, just like let's go down to Kinko's and shoot these portraits and whatever it's called now, FedEx. Interview each speaker to find visually rich quotes about their homeland or journey. So that idea did lead to that concept, but like I just couldn't see it. So the instructions would then be like, analyze your research. So just looking at the research, it might spark that insight that immediately leads to the concept, but really look through it and look for the through lines and the connective tissue or the potential metaphors or even just the things that are interesting to you. Because your insight might not be super heady or storytelling. It might just be rap music has a lot of very iconic 3-dimensional forms associated with it. And then you're like, well, what could we do with those? And it could be like, we could make a graffiti painting or an oil painting, or we could cast them in bronze or whatever it might be. That's not a super deep concept, but that's an insight, like, oh, these are interesting and they're iconic forms. 2, capture your thoughts in the research. What are the through lines between things? How does genre play into this? In your case, like when you're working with movies, like how do the genres figure into it? Because like some of you will do 4 or 5 movies that there is a main connecting normal universally accepted genre, right? But then there's the weird micro genre you've invented. But because of that, like film noir might play into what you're doing. Create simple thesis-like statements, and then if you can imagine multiple concepts around the statement, then you have the insight. If you can only imagine one way to execute it, I think you've jumped past the insight, and you kind of you've got the insight and the concept mixed up. So if you go like, coffee is like oxygen in that we need it to survive, so I'm going to show a person getting an IV drip of coffee, whatever, that was terrible, but you get what I mean? But then there's only one execution to that, right? Because you just defined what the concept is. What you gotta stop at, coffee is like oxygen, right? And then you can have tons of ideas, because you could have typographic ideas, illustrative ideas, photographic ideas, whatever it is, like that's an idea you can expand upon. The thing I described, you could do versions of it, but they're fundamentally the same. Edit down to 5 insights, and then brainstorm 3 potential concepts for each insight for a total of 15. You don't have to sketch these or design them. You have the insight, what are 3 ways you could do them? It should look pretty much like that slide I had a couple pages back, where I just described potential ways of dealing with it. All you're doing is trying to loosely wrap your head around it, and you're testing whether it's an insight. Because if you can't come up with 3 ideas from it, or 3 concepts, it's not. It's a concept. And you gotta pop back and figure out what's the insight that led to the concept. Yeah, let's see, does anybody just based on their general research have like an insight that's popped up yet? Because presumably you do. Like if you've thought of a concept that came out of the research, then you had an insight. Does anybody have anything that's like already kind of, they're throwing around? I'm not gonna judge it, I'm gonna use it as an example. Let me think of one then. I'm gonna use a really obvious one. So let's say Steve was doing the cars as characters in the movie. That one in particular, the microgenre you invented is already basically an insight. In that you could go, okay, the cars are a main character in the movie. And you could define it a little bit more tightly. So you could say, are they the star of the movie? Are they the leading actor of the movie? Are they a co-star? Like, whatever. Are they like a, I don't know, well, partner in crime? However you want to define it. And then from there, you could go, okay, like, what are some ways to illustrate that idea? And I could be like, well, you could do super generic cliche genre pieces. So let's say it's 4 movies and each one's a different genre. You've got like a kid's movie, you've got an action movie, I don't know, romantic comedy and something else, a horror movie, because we have Christine, yeah. So you make the most generic cliche possible version of each of those sorts of posters. So the action one is like italic, distressed orange type with that weird two-tone glow that's on the photography, but then it's a car. And then you do the romantic comedy, and it's like the car embracing another character in the movie, or whatever it might be. But you make super generic posters, but you insert the car as the actual character or the actual star of the movie. That's one idea that I could have from that idea, that car is the main character in these films. And then I'm sure I could have other ones, right? I could do like classic headshots. I could put them on a red carpet, like whatever, right? Like, this is me being stupid right now, but I could come up with a bunch of ideas really quickly. So what I want you to shoot for is that idea of like looking through your research, and sometimes one of your insights will just be the genre you invented because it works, and then other ones it won't. So it will depend, but in all of them, I think like as you're looking through it, you should be able to find those pieces. So like the animals as villains one that Marin did last year. So it was like Mouse Hunt, Jaws, The Sandlot, Arachnophobia. One of the insights was all of these animals, the reality of them is so much more benign. It's very rare to get bit by a shark. These animals are like much less dangerous than the way these movies make them terrifying. So then, like, if you go like, okay, the animals are way less dangerous than the movie, then you could be like, okay, well, what are some ways to show that? Because that could be humorous to do that, right? To make it about Jaws, but then also have like factoids of like just how not dangerous sharks are. Because like, the thing everybody has to realize, like, people didn't go in lakes after Jaws came out. Like, Jaws fucking ruined swimming. It's like super important. Like, this is an SNL sketch where Jaws is knocking on people's doors and eating them. Because like that's how freaked out people were about that movie. The animals are way less dangerous. What are ways of showing that? And then you could be like, it could look like a textbook. They could be like sort of quasi-educational. You could actually just look for the super rare examples of when people do get killed by spiders and sharks and little dogs and whatnot, and mice. And I'm sure I could come up with more. But like her insight, like animals as villains, her genre, animals as villains, that is an insight into itself, and you could have concepts on that, right? Like you could have like the animals could all have trench coats and twisty mustaches and be like old-timey like train robber villains. Or you could have this other insight, like the animals are way less dangerous, or in all of these, the animal's only the villain because the humans won't leave them alone. Maybe. In Jaws, that's not true. But regardless, like, you could come up with something. And the biggest thing I would say is, again, like, think about the funnel idea. Just look through all your research, write down anything that seems interesting, anything that seems like a potential kind of thesis or a through line, and then just pick the 5 that are the most interesting. You know what I mean? Don't sit there and rack your brain to come up with 5. Just look at everything, write down a ton of stuff, and then just go back and pick the 5. But in general, just shoot for quantity over quality. Every dumb idea, like assume you have stupid ideas and then just write down all your dumb ideas. Don't try to be smart. That's like one of the easiest ways to deal with this kind of hard to grasp thing. You just go like, okay, I'm stupid, so what are all my stupid ideas? And then you just pick the 5 best stupid ideas. I'm being like really serious about it. Like you just let yourself off the hook. Don't try to be smart. Because then that way, like if you are smart, you don't have to try. It's gonna work out. And if you're stupid, you don't have to try to be smart. Like just do whatever stupid stuff you want to do and then boom, done. Yes?
Can you define the word thesis as you're using it here?
Yeah, I just mean it as a statement that is like an opinion about the content in some way that will apply across the board in a way that makes sense. So if I say like, it doesn't necessarily have to be even it could be a strategy in some ways, right? Like the hip hop one, that thesis is not really an opinion, it's a strategy. Reinterpret hip hop aesthetics. For whatever reason, like that's one. Potentially that's not actually very strong, but that was the idea I had, so whatever. So it's not entirely like something you have to argue, just needs to be coherent in some way. So it could be like a strategy, or it could be like all of these films are like something, I don't know. They're like neo-noirs, or like let's say we did your gender playground one, and you had this broad historical range of them. Let's say you picked 4 of them, and each one was 20 years apart in terms of release. So you then have like a short history, right? And then you could say these films constitute a timeline of gender exploration in film. Okay, cool, that's the insight. What are some ways of exploring that? And then you just write them down. So that would be potentially one. But then another one might be like, I don't know, I hate having to think of these ideas on the spot. It's always like terrible. But what's that?
So you mean like factual statements, not necessarily an opinion?
I mean, it can be. In general, I just feel like it should be coherent. So like, it can be an opinion if it makes sense. Like if your opinion is like, these movies suck, that's not a great thesis, right? But if your opinion is like, these movies together say they do this, they constitute a history, they show a range of emotional states, let's say, like just throwing that out there, then you could go like, okay, what are ways of doing that? So the insight part's really subtle. It doesn't have to be any one kind of statement. The biggest thing is like, it just doesn't make sense. Like if somebody goes, what do you mean? Or why are you saying that? Or why are you doing that? Can you like have an answer to it? If the answer is, I don't know, well, that's not great, right? Like if this becomes a creative storytelling exercise, we might be missing the point. But I think in general, it's like having something to say, and then the nature of what you have to say ultimately comes down to the way that you're wired, the way that you interpret, the way that you read things. I just want those statements, like they can be totally factual. Color does this in each of these movies. Let's say you're doing that color thing. Color performs an immersive role, let's just say. Which is like a pretty vague thing to say. But then you go like, okay, what are ways of showing that color has an immersive quality? And then you could be like, well, there is a warehouse space, and I put colored gels on every single light in this warehouse, and then just flooded the space with light. That would be immersive. Like, is that the best concept in the world? It doesn't matter at this point, but that idea would have legs, because the other way I could do it is be like, well, I'll use a black and white film still from each movie, and then I'll put a gradient flood of color across those 4 things. So it doesn't have to be deep. And this is what I mean by this idea of, if you have stupid ideas, own it. I don't obviously mean that. What I mean is you have the types of ideas you have. Run with that. Don't worry about having different types of ideas. So it's about the way you interpret the research and the content. Like, that's what I care about. Like, I'm interested in the way that you see it. I'm not interested in like, it doesn't matter how I see the content. I want to know how you see it. I want to see how you break it down, what you see as the through lines between it, which like, I'm sure for some of you is going to be harder than others. Maybe like your brain is not really wired to do this, whereas like my brain, it does this kind of stuff, like it does it so automatically I don't know that it's happening, and I couldn't articulate it for 14 years of working or something like that. But this is what I mean. Like, you just look at the research and you just state the facts as you see them. You share your opinions as you see it. You don't worry about whether it's smart, clever, metaphorical. Because like, if you state the facts as you see them, it's probably coherent. It's just that some of you will probably be really heady and like abstract, and some of you will probably be like facts, like these movies have spikes. Okay, cool. Yeah, like whatever that might be. Does that make sense? Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Is it fair to say, like, to analogize it, what you're calling a thesis, you said it's more like a strategy, and then the concepts are tactics? I mean, is anybody familiar with, strategy and tactics, the difference between those?
Yeah, I actually think that's fair to say. So like if we look at the hip hop poster, my thesis is not really a thesis, it's a strategy. Reinterpret hip hop aesthetics. Cool, there's 1,000 ways to do that. So yeah, and then those things would be the different tactics I could do to do that. So it can be an opinion, it can be a thesis, it can be a strategy. As long as you're able to expand upon that with multiple different executions or multiple different concepts, then you're in the right ballpark. That's the biggest thing. If you look at it and you only have one idea, I don't think you have it. Like, and you need to take a step back and go, there's probably two things in here and I need to break them apart somehow. And once you do that, you should find the kernel that leads to all kinds of other stuff. And I think that you will. I think this sounds more complicated than it is. But once you start looking at the research, if you don't make yourself come up with graphic design ideas, which is like visual concepts, this is going to be very natural. And some of you probably do this automatically, and it's very natural to come up with a statement and then figure out ways of executing that statement. I know for me, it really wasn't. They were all wrapped up together. And I think it's very common of like people I've worked with that it's all wrapped up. But I'm sure that some of you, like, you'll look through research and be like, oh, here's an idea, and you'll just capture the idea and you'll deal with it later. But like for me, I had to unlearn the way I was working in order to recognize like, oh, what I thought was an idea was actually a step past it. It was like I went too far down the road before I like kind of figured it out. But in general, your goal is going to be to have a bunch of ideas and then just look for the top 5, and then from those top 5, just write down 3 potential ways of executing it. We don't want to do a ton of work on stuff we're going to kill. We just want to do enough work to see if it's interesting. But like the idea of doing like, all right, 5 of these, 10 concepts each, I don't want to waste that much time doing stuff you're not going to do. I figure if you can come up with 3 ideas, you probably could come up with 10. And then later, when you pick one, then go nuts. But right now, you're just trying to figure out if the insight's got some legs to it. Once it's full, take a break, come back to it, and be like, that idea's cool, that idea's cool, that idea's cool, and that idea's cool. And then boom, you're done. Much easier to do that than to try to have 5 good ideas. Like, just don't worry about having good ideas. It's a waste of time.